Welcome to the Unraveling Shaltazar podcast. Hello, Jeffrey. Welcome.
Welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for being here again for another episode of Unraveling Shaltazar.
Yes. Actually, it's a dual episode of Unraveling Shaltazar today. I was listening to a couple messages myself earlier today, and I was attracted to one called Becoming the Observer. Short message, doesn't have a date on it. I've been, exploring this idea of becoming more of the observer and less the human participant in my life, if that makes sense. And so I was attracted to this message, and I listened to it, and it was short, and so I kind of browsed around for another one, and I found this one, another message, this one called Stillness Speaks, and found them to be really interestingly interrelated and connected. So I thought we could kind of do a Shaltazar mashup today and kind of talk about both of these messages together.
Excellent choice. Excellent choice. Something I would call a twofer, right? 2 for 1.
Exactly.
It's like a 2 for 1
right.
I think in the stores they call it, what is it? BOGO, right?
Yeah. Buy one, get one.
Yeah,
exactly.
buy one, get one. So we buy. And it's really interesting you chose these because they are shorter, and you're right, they don't have an age on them or a date on them because it was very nostalgic as I listened to them this morning. Getting ready for our recording, because those two are part of the original 16. And for those that don't recall, my channeling relationship with Shaltazar came through in my journaling. And for many years, I would have an early morning journaling process. In the beginning, it was to dump out my emotional baggage. And eventually I started asking questions and answers came back. And I started to live by those answers. And I said to myself, they're too good to keep to myself. And it's really kind of interesting because, in amongst these handwritten journals, I knew were these pearls of wisdom, but how do I get them out? And so I remember having someone that I was helping out, giving some complimentary coaching. And I thought, okay, well, here's an intern. Maybe I'll get that person to comb through the journals and maybe find appropriate messages. Well, that didn't work out because obviously Shaltazar needed me to do that. I even tried to give the job to my wife, and that didn't work. And so eventually I had to comb through those journals and find appropriate messages hidden in all of the personal journaling that I thought would be worthy of sharing. And I thought that the best way to share them was in a more of a sensory way. And I decided I would have the spoken word recorded and have someone do background music. So I found 16 of these messages, went to this guy's basement over a period of time. Beautiful guy, wonderful, talented individual. He recorded my voice. He created the background music, and we turned it into a 2-disc CD set. And so the two that you have chosen today have a real, I have a fond memory. There's a soft spot in my heart for them because they were the beginning of that journey. They were part of that 16 2-disc CD set. And so it totally makes sense to me that you would have chosen them. It's not that you chose two very diverse, different ones. They're from the same genre. They're probably 12, 13 years ago. And it was interesting because one of them even starts out by talking about the turbulent times. And I thought Shaltazar just said that these days, but it looks like Shaltazar has been telling us about the turbulent times for a number of years. So how those come across are a little bit different as far as I'm concerned, because they're the beginning of them teaching me how to connect. And both of those messages have a commonality in learning to connect to the higher power. And I see certainly how, my channeling relationship has evolved, the length of the messages, the complexity of them are quite different. And they were, like, I was in kindergarten, and they were feeding me these short little messages on how to strengthen my connection to the invisible world. And so I really appreciate you choosing these, because, as I said, it's very nostalgic for me.
Oh, good. Well, that's interesting. I obviously I was completely unaware that they were part of. I knew that you had told me before that there were an original 16, the Sweet 16, that you had recorded, but I never really know where in the timeline any of them fit unless there's a date attached to them, and so it's kind of an interesting exploration for me too when I kind of go mine through the vault and pick some to enjoy. So
yeah,
very interesting.
And I may add, I think I haven't counted lately, but I think we're up to like 108 or 110 of them. So it's kind of neat. And dates are hard to find on the originals because I didn't really date them. It's only in the last few years that, there's so many. I realized that we needed to be able to look more chronologically. And so those earlier ones don't really have firm dates on them. But they're kind of neat because I think that they, as I say, they're beginner teachings on how we can connect to the invisible world. And the one you mentioned first, becoming the observer, has always been a favorite of mine because, and I still refer to invoking the observer. And that is to allow that part of you that has been here many times before, that part of you that is maybe your higher self, to watch on. And it's interesting because some of the phrases in there are still ones that I still use and love using, where the observer watches on to the actor that goes by your name. And that one's kind of like, okay, I get that. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes sense to me that this would have been kind of a Shaltazar primer for your being able to connect with them, because it's goes back to kind of that very basic idea of being still. And in many messages, Shaltazar says, "Be still, be more still, be still again," right? And so that's kind of like the jumping off point to connecting to all this stuff is quieting the mind and being able to stop the mental noise and let Shaltazar in, right?
Yes, absolutely. And if you can look at it, or if you choose to see it from my perspective, this is a guy who'd been in the corporate world for over 30 years, whose mind was buzzing like crazy, who thought that the person with the most thoughts wins the race, and is trying to bring forth this divine wisdom. So you could see, like you say, as a primer or kindergarten, they had to keep reiterating. And it's so interesting, those messages, like I say, have a very different style because they repeat the same basic premise of stillness, quieting the mind, opening your feeling consciousness. Those teachings, those insights are still there in the more recent Shaltazar messages, but they needed to really ground them in me. They needed to really get them across to me in a way that I would really understand it. I was very pleasantly surprised to see that in one of those messages they talked about feelings and not be afraid of the lower and slower feelings. And it's like, wow, that came way back then. And but only do I understand it at that deeper level. Shaltazar often talks about layers of learning, and that was, I guess, one of the lower levels of the beginning of teaching. Which, by the way, one of my favorite lines is "Be still, be more still, be still again," because it's so redundant. And only recently have I really thought, why is that they say "Be still, be more still, be still again"? And I see it as the layers of stillness, not stillness as being a definitive, but it's sort of like We talked about, I think in a previous episode, about looking at the surface of the water versus deep dive down, and how different the water is below the surface. And I think that's what stillness is. I really think that stillness it has layers to it. And your mind can be quiet, but the stillness that they're talking about, where you let go of your physical being. When I was listening to it this morning, I got a sense of a near-death experience, that they were bringing you to that point where you were just moving outside of your body, and being able to really be just more energy and vibration than physicality. Yeah, if that makes any sense to you.
Yeah, well, one of the things that it talks about in here in Becoming the Observer is the idea of transcending the duality, and it talks about it's as if you are two selves. Allow one self to feel all there is to feel, and at the same time allow the other self, the higher self, to watch on with love. And so that kind of suggests this. I use a big word, like this bifurcation of your being, right? When I listened to that, the kind of the image that came up was like the idea of being in a movie theater and watching a movie, or perhaps being at a sporting event watching a competition, because you're there, your physical body is there, watching this thing happen before you. And you become emotionally invested in it, right? You get invested in the characters and the action and things that are going on. You have physical reactions. You might feel anxiety, tenseness. You might feel compassion. You might feel sadness. So there's all these different feelings. This thing that you're watching is evoking, but you're not actually participating in it. You're watching it. You're observing it, and that was kind of in my mind, like the analogy that came up, as to what that meant by, you having two selves and one of them being back here, kind of looking down on what's going on.
Yeah, no, excellent analogy. And my sense is the purpose they told us that is to gain the objectivity, to gain the perspective. I used to tell my coaching clients, come up to the mountaintop with me, and we can sort of look at what's been going on in your life, from the bigger picture perspective. And I really sense that what they're suggesting in Becoming the Observer is to be able to look at that bigger picture perspective. It reminds me of the people that recount a near-death experience where they're lying in the hospital bed and yet they're hovering above themselves, watching on as the doctors and nurses are working on trying to save their life. So very similar to that sporting event analogy. And so I think it's important. Shaltazar always says these things with a purpose. It's not just for entertainment, like, oh, let's practice being the observer. I think the deeper insight is that by gaining that perspective, by looking at it from beyond just being in the forest, trying to chop down the trees, you are up on the hill looking at the whole forest. And I think that's what they really want us to realize, that sometimes we don't see what's going on. I often have come to realize that when I'm anticipating something, it feels a certain way. When I'm going through that which I'm anticipating, that may be difficult or challenging, again, it feels a different way. And then when it's over and I look back, it feels again a different way. And each of those, you are really in the minute. You are in the anticipation of the event. You're in the event happening. You're in the post-event period. And by becoming the observer, you get to sort of watch all three at the same time. And the learning and growth will surface, because you say, oh, yeah. And I remember a number of episodes ago we talked about, if we only knew in high school what we knew today, life would be very different, right? And I think by invoking the observer, you get an opportunity to look at more of the whole picture. You get to see the younger you, the present you, and the future you. And it's pretty powerful, because it that perspective, that objective perspective, can really help you get through some of the things that you think are so onerous that you'll never get through.
Right. Yeah. Well, and when you're saying that, it brings me back to my day job. I use Google Earth quite a bit, and so when you drop down into Street View and you put your little man on the road, or anywhere, I guess, where the cameras have driven, you could be almost anywhere. You don't really know where you are. But when you pop out and you zoom back out to the perspective of the moon, you're like, oh, I'm in the United States, or oh, I'm in Canada, or I'm in China. So you do feel in life lost in the weeds a bit, I think, from time to time, and being able to step back and take that 10,000 foot view is comforting. I guess it makes you feel more connected and more comforted.
Well, right, and I think it sometimes minimizes the stuff we're going through in the moment, and I think that's important. Again, I want to emphasize that no matter what Shaltazar is telling us, there is a practical application. They are bringing forth, higher wisdom. They are bringing forth divine wisdom, but all of it has practical applications, and that's what I love doing this series with you, because we can sort of help bring some of that practicality forward, and that whole observer, I think, helps with an important principle, and that's perspective. I think a lot of people going through COVID, there are people that are really, really suffering because they are taking a particular perspective. I think some people are doing much better, and that's because they are taking a different perspective. And so Shaltazar says, and many, many teachers have said it, that your perspective determines your reality. And so the observer is a way to shift your perspective and thus shift your reality. Before we started recording, you and I were talking about that day job that isn't quite as exciting as the amazing things that we get to do, talking about spiritual wisdom. And so there's an opportunity for you to invoke the observer in that part of your life that may not feel as fulfilling, to see if you can get a different perspective to invoke some change in your life. Sure.
Well, and you're talking about the practicality of some of these messages, right? So becoming the observer is sort of the goal or the result that you would like to achieve. The other message, Stillness Speaks, is sort of the instruction manual to get there, in a way. And it also has one of the lines that I've heard you repeat over and over again, is that beyond the nothingness lies great riches.
Yes.
So it's telling us to quiet the mind over here to be able to get to that place where you can be the observer.
Brilliant. Right on. 100%. I couldn't have said it better myself here. That's why I love doing these things with you. It's exactly right. That in order to be able to become the observer, okay, it's kind of a very abstract concept. So how the hell do you become the observer? How do you watch yourself? How do you become two people, without getting locked up in a mental institution, right? So that's not the object of the game. So you're absolutely right. They are giving us this instruction manual of telling us to be still, be more still, be still again, be comfortable with the void, let go of the mind, just beyond the nothingness lies great riches, for that purpose of being able to find the observer. I believe that the observer is within all of us, but it's deep below some of the human jabberings that are going on, right? And how do we find that part of us that's very passive, that's very loving, that's very nurturing, that's very hidden? And what they're telling us, you're absolutely right, is they're giving us all of these hints of stillness and nothingness. There's another line in there that says something along the lines of, when your mind has said enough, go one step further. I don't think I'm quoting it exactly right, but they're saying that the mind is going to lose patience and it's going to want to come back to doing its jabbering. But wait. When the mind says enough, go one step farther. Go to that deep silence, right? Shaltazar, in the message, It Just Doesn't Matter, they really take us through what some people have said feels like a near-death experience. They actually allow our humanness to be in such a resting place while we're still alive that we are able to invoke that divinity. We're able to connect to that higher self so that it can help us and guide us through the difficult trials and tribulations that often people have.
Right. Well, and there's a line in here that said basically, and I'm paraphrasing, that once you get still and the mind chatter stops, that's when we come rushing in, and that voice you hear is the voice of God.
Yes.
So
yes.
That's how we get to that place of transcending the duality, right? Because now we are on the perhaps the cosmic or God or Shaltazar side of the veil, looking back at us sitting in our seat doing whatever it is we're doing on the physical side of the veil. So.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, one of the messages ends with, and I kind of even thought that I did a pretty good job how I said it, and something about you will find yourself in the cradle of God's arms or something like that. And it's like, whoa, that put shivers all through me.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. And just to bring our conversation back around full circle, this is the beginning of my training. And so I needed to be trained. And because of that, my connection to Shaltazar has evolved and matured. And that's why I had such a deep desire to share it with others. So these early messages, those shorter messages, helped me develop a stronger relationship to the invisible world, and I encourage listeners to do the same. So it's easy to say, well, there's not as much really interesting stuff in these messages. It's kind of, it's short and it's not as profound. But it is the training ground. So I highly recommend that people listen to them over and over again. I know I did, because it's one thing to say I'm going to be still. It's another to practice, be still, be more still, and be still again. To be able to get to that point when you can actually connect to the observer and bring it forth more of the time is certainly an art. They call it the art of surrender.
Right. Yeah. That's fabulous. Well, looks like we've used up our time, so I hope this was beneficial to people, and I hope they do take you up on your suggestion to listen to these, because especially anybody that's just kind of starting out, or perhaps has just recently been introduced to Shaltazar, this kind of would be an interesting jumping in point for them, perhaps, because they are shorter and they are recognizable as meditative practice and maybe a good place to become familiar. Yeah,
and thank you for choosing that, because I'm going to be doing a new series of events called Shaltazar Deep Dive, where I'm going to be taking some of the messages of Shaltazar and really going into them word by word, phrase by phrase. And I probably would not have considered this one because it's so short, and how can I do a Shaltazar Deep Dive on that? But you've inspired me to realize that there is so much more in this. Although it's just short, there is such a wealth of instruction and helping us to connect, that I think I will add this to the list of deep dive Shaltazar events that I do. So thank you for choosing it. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you for allowing me to be nostalgic and get back to my roots of how I started connecting to Shaltazar. So thank you so much for that, Mark.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure. I'm glad it had that impact. So thank you very much, and we'll pick this up again next time with a new message.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Love and light to everyone.
If you have any questions about the Master Teachings of Shaltazar, we invite you to submit them to Jeffrey at jeffreyeisen.com, and we will make your question the topic of a future episode.